Hello and welcome to Global News Today here on Al Arabiya English with me, your host, Michal Prendergast. Today, as famine grips Gaza, 28 nations call for an end to the war, slamming Israel's aid tactics. Plus, we'll turn to a deep dive into Chinese EV dominance with insight from the former BBC Top Gear presenter, Steve Berry. As the world watches the deepening starvation crisis in Gaza, 28 nations have issued a rare, blunt call for an immediate end to the war. They've cited inhumane aid conditions and the killing of civilians who are seeking food. They've condemned Israel's tactics as worsening an already catastrophic humanitarian collapse. The signatories are foreign ministers of the UK and 27 other nations, including Australia, Canada, France, Italy and Japan. The statement begins by declaring the war in Gaza must end now. Well, for more on this, I'm joined by Dr. Sara Husseini, the director of the British Palestinian Committee. Thanks so much for joining me, Sara. As someone with deep ties to Palestine, how do you personally cope with the helplessness of witnessing this level of suffering from a distance?
I think it's incredibly difficult. I think we're really at a loss for words, especially as Palestinians in the UK and everywhere else. I think I represent an organisation called the British Palestinian Committee, and we saw a statement yesterday come out from the UK government along with other European governments condemning effectively the suffering of Palestinians in Gaza. But actually, we need to really take a step back and take a look at the reality of this moment and the context that this statement came in. So on Sunday, 92 people were shot dead while trying to get food at aid points in North and South Gaza for them and their families. Yesterday, Israeli tanks began a ground invasion of Deir al-Balah, where thousands of displaced and forcibly starved people are sheltering, marking yet another escalation and the first time, in fact, that area has been invaded by ground. We've seen the executive director of UNICEF tell the world that on average 28 children per day, that's the equivalent to one whole class of school children per day for 650 plus days, have now been murdered. And experts are warning that the extent of forced starvation has become so bad that even if food gets to people now immediately, it'll be too late for many of them. So these are not just people, these are our friends, these are our colleagues. They're either being massacred, tortured or slowly starved. And it's everyone, it's children, it's mothers, it's fathers, doctors, nurses, teachers, street sweepers and shopkeepers, all being completely stripped of their dignity, made to beg for food at aid stations where they're being lured out and then exterminated. Now, what I would say about the statement that the government has made, not only has the UK government done nothing to stop this whatsoever, it's actually continued to provide diplomatic and military support to the very forces carrying out these war crimes, providing crucial parts for the F-35 fighter jets, allowing use of their air bases in Cyprus, training IOF soldiers in the UK on UK soil. So the statement that we saw yesterday is both woefully inadequate, more than that, it's cynical and it's disingenuous, and it really is an insult to the intelligence of the wider British public.
The joint statement from the 28 nations has called Israel's aid model dangerous and inhumane. What do you think will be the impact of this?
It is dangerous and inhumane, and there should be efforts immediately to stop it. I'll give you an example from colleagues at Forensic Architecture, which is a really important organisation doing research work, who have done a really detailed studies on everything that's happening since the genocide started 2 years ago, and obviously beyond that and across Palestine. They have explained how these aid stations are often open for very brief periods of time. They will announce 70 minutes ahead of time that the station will be opened, meaning Palestinians have a short time to get there. And then there are 10 minutes where these stations are open. So what they've been telling us is people some of whom have had to walk 6 hours or so to get to an aid station, have been having to camp in really dangerous places and areas. Everywhere is dangerous in Gaza, but particularly areas away from home and being displaced once again. So that the aid stations are actually causing the forcible displacement. And then, as we've talked about before, and we know when people are getting to these aid stations, they're often being shot almost like fish in a barrel. It's absolutely disgusting. So yes, the aid stations are incredibly dangerous, but the statement is not actually calling for anything concrete. There's some calling on the Israeli government, again, 650 days into some of the worst crimes against humanity we've witnessed this century. There are statements about urging the Israeli government. There are some vague promises about being prepared to take further action. We are way, way beyond that. There are a number of things the government and all 28 states could be doing right now. One, fulfilling their international obligations to prevent, punish, end complicity in genocide. Applying immediate sanctions, comprehensive sanctions to the state that is committing war crimes, that is the state of Israel. And actually in the UK here as well, making sure that it's ending the repression of its own citizens, the people who are here in the UK, Palestinians, other communities, citizens of conscience who are speaking out against the unimaginable horrors that are happening to our people in Gaza and being repressed and criminalised for that.
And the statement itself is unusually blunt. What do you think has finally pushed countries like the UK, France and Japan to speak out so strongly now?
I mean, again, I think if the live stream genocide over almost 2 years is not enough to be speaking out, they should have been speaking out this strongly from day one. It was only 3 months into the start of this genocide in January that the International Court of Justice already said that there was enough evidence for a plausible case of genocide. And states have done, by and large, not all states, but by and large states have done very little. And so I think to come out strongly now is fine, but it's very, very late. And there are many other things that the states should be doing rather than giving, I think it's potentially also to do with pressure from the public and a response to that by trying to give some kind of rhetorical assurances to their own citizens and public who are absolutely horrified by this, by the atrocities they've been witnessing, to try and diffuse some of that pressure. But I don't think it's working. Nobody's buying it.
And Israel have said Hamas is to blame for the war in Gaza as they started it. How do you respond to that?
I respond to that by talking about the decades of colonization and occupation that have gone before the 17 years of siege on Gaza that was far before October 2023. This is about the sixth war, I think, on Gaza in about 20 years. So we're talking about something that goes far, far beyond October 2023 and actually has its roots here in the UK with British colonialism, the laying of the groundwork for the State of Israel through the Balfour Declaration, and then laying the foundations for the Nakba in 1948, which was the largest and the first mass dispossession of Palestinians, which we've now seen repeated again in the last 2 years.
And in regards to the recognition of a Palestinian state, how do you think the joint statement is going to affect this endeavour?
It's hard to say. I mean, this is something that is a very easy symbolic step that hasn't happened so far. It's something that, whatever its merits or not, or merits or drawbacks, will achieve nothing on the ground without the accountability that is needed. And until states are ready to hold Israel to account and to end their own complicity in doing so, nothing will change. I think there are positive examples, actually, that the UK and these countries that have signed this statement could look to. Only a few days ago, we saw a joint statement from the Hague Emergency Conference on Palestine, which was held in Bogota in Colombia, where states committed to advancing concrete measures to uphold their obligations under international law. So these are things like preventing the provision of transfer of arms, not allowing any vessels to dock or servicing them in their ports if they are at risk of carrying any kind of munitions or arms that might aid the genocide that Israel is perpetrating, urgently reviewing all of their public institutions and their ties to make sure they're not funding anything that supports Israel's illegal occupation, and so on. So there are a number of very concrete steps that these states could be taking.
And in regard to the UK government are allowing pro-Palestinian voices to protest, we've seen a lot of crackdowns on this. What's the feeling on the ground in London?
It's Orwellian, honestly. What we've seen here from the British government are attempts to crush any support for Palestinians or Palestine in British public life. Only days ago, we saw a woman holding a Palestinian flag in Kent, and sit with us, and a sign saying "Free Palestine." She was threatened by police with arrest under the Terrorism Act. And we've got to take a moment to think about what it means. That's criminalising our very flag as Palestinians. It's suggesting, it's a deeply racist suggestion that the Palestinian flag is somehow to be equated with terrorism. So there's a massive overreach here happening by the police, which contributes to this wider chilling effect on Palestinian advocacy. The idea is to scare people from speaking out against the genocide. And that's not to mention the kind of decades of dehumanization and racism that has been spread through political media, political discourse, public discourse, which has allowed for this repression in the UK, but also is recognised as a preparatory step towards genocide. Dehumanisation is a key step needed to reach what we've reached and what we're seeing happening in Gaza, because if we're not seen as human, it's much easier to kill us. So I think what's happening here in the UK is absolutely, as I say, Orwellian. It's horrifying, if not completely shocking. I think the reason I say that is that, of course, British colonial policy abroad, which this is very much an extension of, has always translated into the erosion of civil liberties here in the UK. And so we're seeing not only Palestinians being affected, a whole range of marginalised communities that also have suffered from Britain's colonial legacy, but also British society more broadly. As I say, a majority of the public here have been in favour of a ceasefire, have been in favour of suspending arms sales immediately, and their rights and their right to protest, their right to freedom of speech, all of these things are being impacted incredibly negatively. So it's something that we should all be concerned about as British citizens and human beings.
What repercussions can people face for speaking on behalf of Palestine in the UK? Is it able to cost people jobs? Are people being cancelled, as it were?
Certainly. I mean, that's been happening for a very long time, but very quietly and pervasively, I think. It's happening more because in the past 2 years, I think also more because people are willing to speak out, or even though they may be afraid because they've been put, the fear has been put into them. And these kind of politicised definitions of anti-Semitism and terrorism have been used to try and shut down any form of criticism for the state of Israel. More people have been brave, have been courageous, have spoken up for what they've seen is wrong, which is, as I say, a live-streamed genocide for the past almost 2 years now. And yeah, there have been a lot of ways of threatening the people, losing jobs, of silencing them. And now we're seeing, increasing attempts to criminalise under the law as well, which is deeply, deeply shocking.
And in a past interview, I've seen you say that Britain bears responsibility for what's happening in Palestine today, and that you were shocked by UK foreign policy. What specifically shocked you the most?
Well, I don't remember saying I'm shocked. I think I go between being shocked and being completely unsurprised, but just horrified. But anyway, I think it's just the fact that Britain does bear this responsibility from the outset, and what any British government now should be doing is making corrections and making the wrongs right. We've gone past the British colonial era, and the British government should be acknowledging what has happened in Palestine, the fact that it, as I say, laid the groundwork for the creation of a state on top of Palestinians, on top of Palestinian lands, which paved the way for massacres and dispossession and displacement, the likes of which we've only actually seen to the same extent. It's been going on slowly but surely over over decades, but we've seen it to an even greater extent now in the past 2 years. And so Britain really, rather than continuing to double down and support a state that is in the dock for genocide, that has committed war crimes, oppression, that has broken all kinds of international humanitarian law, has a whole rap sheet of international violations that it's committed and are documented, Britain should be really the front and centre country leading on fulfilling its duties to the Palestinian people, both morally and legally.
And what we're hearing is reports of hundreds of civilians have been killed for just trying to reach food and water. How do you describe the reality of accessing aid in Gaza now?
Beyond words. I mean, I have so many friends and friends and colleagues in Gaza, and they're talking about how they're just watching their families starve and not being able to access food points. As we said, the fact that we're even talking about this as aid is misleading. It's not that people need aid. This is a forced starvation. This is a man-made blockade. And so people can't get foodstuffs, not because they're poor and can't buy food. They can't get foodstuffs because they're being forcibly and deliberately starved. It is absolutely unconscionable that this can be allowed to happen in this day and age. And not only that this is not only being the countries and states, including those who have made the joint statements, and the British government have not only failed to act and fulfil their duties and obligations, they're actually aiding and abetting with material support the continued atrocities by the Israeli government.
And of course, you have family in Jerusalem and in the West Bank right now. How are they describing the feeling on the ground there?
I mean, the feeling is one of absolute, again, helplessness, horror, just despair at the fact that this can even be allowed to be happening, that we feel powerless to stop it, that many people around the world are doing everything they can but feel powerless to stop it. And yet all of our political leaders, or many of our political leaders, particularly here in the West, are doing actually the complete opposite. They're not holding anybody accountable. They're, in fact, being part and parcel of this and being complicit. And so it's incredibly important. I think family and friends take heart from the fact that the British public over here are on the streets marching in their thousands and hundreds and thousands, and have been doing so again for the past 22 months. That gives us some kind of semblance of hope, but also just cannot believe that we are in a position where we are not able still to put an end to this horror.
The statement rejects Israel's idea of moving Gazans into a so-called humanitarian city. They're calling it a violation of international law. How do you see this as a step towards something more serious, legal consequences or accountability for Israel?
I mean, until we see action, and the actions that I've laid out and described today with you, I don't know how. There's been condemnations are not new. Condemnations are not new since the past month. They're not new since the past 2 years. They're not new for the decades before this. As I say, there's so many decades and decades of condemnations and violations that Israel has committed, and statements from people. And so until we see some actual accountability, some concrete measures, such as the ones we've seen the commitment to from, for example, those countries who are part of this Hague Emergency Conference, it's hard to see how these statements will change anything.
Okay, we're just out of time. Dr. Sara Husseini, Director of the British Palestinian Committee, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Michael.
Now, moving on to the world of EV production, China is leading the race. As their electric vehicles flood global markets, legacy car brands in the West are struggling to keep up. With bans on petrol engines looming and EV tech advancing fast, is the West falling behind for good? To break all it down, I'm joined by former Top Gear presenter Steve Berry, who's live from Manchester. Thanks so much for your time, Steve. So China's EV juggernaut is now, well, I mean, it's dominating the world. Is this a disaster for legacy brands like, you've got BMW, you've got Toyota, you've got Mercedes and Volkswagen? What does this mean for them?
I think it means nothing less than the end of volume sales for those legacy manufacturers. And I'll give you two reasons why. One, the price of the product, and two, the quality of the product. The stuff that's coming out of China. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Japanese motorcycles took over the motorcycle industry. And people used the phrase back then, a disparaging phrase, jack crap. I didn't, because as a young man, I could see the quality of the Japanese machinery that was coming over. Nobody is calling the cars that are coming out of China by any sort of disparaging name, if they've actually experienced one. The likes of the BYD being the most popular brand name for a Chinese car here in the UK, along with MG, which does rankle with me a bit, because I drive a real MG, not what made it. Mine was made in Oxfordshire, not a province of China, but they bought the name, they've got the rights to the name. The MG is very popular in the UK. And these cars are high quality. They're not just as good as the stuff that's coming out of Europe and Japan. Often they're better, and they're considerably more affordable.
So the West, well, in my opinion and the opinion of a lot of people, it's rushed to ban the internal combustion engine. It's put a lot of unfair pressure on the traditional automakers. What's your opinion on that?
I wish you'd asked me 15 years ago. I went to Ryton near Coventry to test drive what was then a new Peugeot electric car. And it was appalling in almost every department in terms of the performance, the ride, the handling, the weight of the batteries, which were the old lead acid batteries. This is 15 years ago. That's what an electric car had then. And they made the thing, it was a simple Peugeot hatchback, but the local council in Coventry had decided, of course, Coventry, the home of Jaguar, we might talk about them shortly. The local council decided they wanted to be lean, green and mean, and they asked Peugeot to build these electric cars. This is, again, it's about 15, 17 years ago. They were appalling. The quality of electric cars now is fantastic, and the decision has been made. I hate to be the sort of person who cuts off a good question, but the question should have been asked a long time ago. The decisions have been made. Car makers have been compelled. They haven't been asked. They've been compelled to completely change their product. An electric car is as different from an internal combustion car as it is from a blinking helicopter. You might as well ask them to start making flat screen TVs instead. A modern electric car shares less than 7% of its components with its internal combustion engine equivalent these days. It's a completely different product. And if you designed a product to deliver an industry into the hands of China, it would be the electric car.
And ICE engines now are hitting around 97% efficiency. Was it too soon to push them out?
I think so. A friend of mine is a very senior engineer at one of the largest and most respected car makers in the world. He's a very technically minded man. He's a brilliant man. And his frustration at the fact that the motor industry has spent 140 years perfecting the internal combustion engine. I come from Bury, Lancashire, in the northwest of England, the original industrial part of the world, the first part of the world that was industrialised. And my hometown, which is the smallest metropolitan borough in Britain, Bury, was twinned with the place in Germany that was the birthplace of Benz, one of the originators of internal combustion engines. And I often thought, as I went into the public library, there was a display, photographs of him, some mementos from his life and stuff like that. And I used to think, I wonder what he'd think of what he and the pioneers of internal combustion would think of what we've done with his engine, what we've achieved with the engine that men of the 19th century, not the 20th century, what we've done with that invention. And getting back to my pal, the engineer, he said, Steve, we've more or less perfected internal combustion. It is physically impossible to extract more potential. He used that word because he's German and he's very scientifically minded. We have extracted the maximum potential from petrol and diesel. And at almost the exact moment that we achieve that, we're told to stop making those engines. There is a dreadful irony, I think you'd agree.
And it's governments themselves, they've mandated the banning of these cars. But the mining of lithium, which goes into these electric cars, is also deeply polluting, especially to the environment, especially to workers all over the world who are exploited in the extraction of these minerals.
There are all kinds of side issues when it comes to electric cars. Where is the electricity coming from? How is the electricity generated? How long will electric cars last in the real world in comparison to internal combustion engine cars? I don't know how well-travelled you are. Obviously, you're not in your native
Extremely,
land right now.
extremely.
I'm very much in my native land. I'm about 6 miles down the road from the hospital that I was born in. I've lived here for most of my life. But I have been lucky enough through my career as a motoring journalist to travel extensively. And I've travelled a lot in Africa. And like a lot of people who go to Africa and have an interest in motoring and in transport and in cars, I've come back with those tales of those Peugeot and Mercedes taxis that have done literally millions of miles or kilometres in 30 or 40 years of daily use in some of the most difficult parts of the world. Now, can you imagine an electric car doing that? I can't. Really, it's a technology for the developed world. Internal combustion. I was in Halifax, Nova Scotia. See, I am well travelled. I was in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and there were thousands of used cars on the shoreline there in Halifax, the main port on the east side of Canada, waiting to go to Africa. The Canadians had finished with them. The cars couldn't match their new emissions laws. So what were they doing? Were they crushing them and getting rid of them and their terrible emissions creating internal combustion engines? No, sir. They were sending them to Africa where they could emit as much horrible gas and smoke and particles as they like for another 30 years. And I just thought, I stood there, like I say, on the dock in Halifax and thought, this epitomises the true nature of this environmental quest that we seem to be on. Let's look like we're saving the planet, but let's move our dirt, sweep our dirt under the carpet. You know what I'm saying?
And another point on that, Steve, it's vastly more economical as well as environmentally friendly to buy one car, to maintain it for your whole life. It can last for 50 or 60 years if maintained correctly, rather than buying a car every 5 or 10 years.
Do you remember? You wouldn't, because it's before my time, and as you can see from my haggard features on the shot that I'm looking at right now, I seem to have turned into my father for some reason I'm not quite sure about. But I'm 61 years old, and it's before my time. Alec Guinness, Obi-Wan Kenobi, starred in a film back in the day called The Man in the White Suit. And it was about someone who invents a textile fabric that never wears and you never need to replace. And of course, that's the last thing that the world actually wants. The last thing that the world wanted was a car like the Mercedes 190. Built a regular car, a Mercedes, yes, but a regular car built for regular people that would go and go and go forever, that would shrug off 500,000 kilometres like it was nothing, that would go on to 1,000,000 kilometres, and also which could be repaired quite easily by a mechanic with some skill in a backstreet garage. Truthfully, even Mercedes, I think, would admit that they made a mistake there. Because ideally what you'd like to do, and I've had this straight from the mouth of a senior motor industry executive who'd had one too many martinis at the bar with me. And he said, do you know what, Steve? The ideal customer for us is someone who buys a car, takes it up to about 50 to 60,000 miles after about 4 or 5 years of use, and then comes back to us for another car. If people stopped doing that, we would go out of business. And one of the problems with electric cars, certainly in the developed world, is that they have far fewer components than an internal combustion engine car. There's far less on an electric car to be serviced, to wear out and therefore require replacing. And also because electric cars, the stuff that they're made out of, I don't think they're going to rust like internal combustion engine cars. In other words, the problem with electric cars is it might be a bit too good and they might last a bit too long, even for manufacturers. The thing about them, of course, that people will say is, oh, well, when the batteries run out, you know, but of course, batteries can be relatively easily replaced. A lot easier than trying to fix a gearbox on an Alfa Romeo, I can tell you that from personal experience.
Yes, and moving on to, I suppose, the need of supercars. Most people, they don't need them. They just need a car for the school run or a commuter vehicle. I think this is where China's affordability on EVs helps them to really pull ahead.
Yeah, I think, as I said, I think what's going to happen, it gives me no pleasure, to be honest, but maybe it's someone else's turn. You know, why should it be us? Why should it be Britain, France, the States and Japan that dominate the motor industry? Why not China? Why shouldn't it be their turn? If they can offer a product that's cheaper and better, why not? But I do think that when it comes to supercars, those names, those evocative, soul-stirring names, Lamborghini, Aston Martin, Corvette, Supra, those names that have fired the blood of young men and women around the world for decades, that appeal, that attraction will still make people work endless hours in jobs that they hate so that they can get their hands on one of those cars. I remember the first time I got a Lotus, and it had just been a lifelong ambition. I'm the guy who made a pilgrimage to the site of the Lotus, the first Lotus factory, and then rode up a very big hill to the pub where Colin Chapman, the founder of Lotus's parents lived, where he built the very first Lotus, and stood there in the courtyard thinking, wow, the first Lotus was built here. And so to actually own one of those cars for me had been the fulfillment of a lifelong ambition. And I think that's where the Chinese motor industry will have a lot of catching up to do. So you can't buy well, you can buy history. I was going to say, all kinds of British, legendary British names have been bought by India, by China, by America. You can very much buy history, but you can't create history in a few years' time. It takes decades to build a name like Aston Martin, Ferrari, you know, all of those names. And I think they will remain, and they will build internal combustion engine cars. Horacio Pagani in Italy has just gone back to internal combustion engines only, because he simply said, when asked why, he said, because nobody wants a Pagani hybrid or a Pagani electric. They want a V12 dead tree burning monster of an engine that makes a noise that puts a grin on the face of anyone with an ounce of soul.
So you've driven a lot of these cars. Obviously, you're a presenter on Top Gear. How did that opportunity come about? Well,
the thing was, I'm from the era of Top Gear when we were all journalists. It was believed at the BBC that if you presented a programme about a subject, you should be an expert. So if the subject was, say, the Tudor monarchs, they'd ring up Oxford University and Cambridge University and maybe Durham, and they'd find an eccentric professor who wasn't afraid of the camera, and they'd get him or her to present the programme. If they were presenting a programme about science, you know, like physics, they'd go and find an affable, likeable genius like Professor Brian Cox, who I know because he's from the same part of the world as me. Well, not just that I know him, but not everybody knows it. I mean, Greater Manchester's got 4.7 million people. We don't all know each other, you know, but I do know him. And it was the same with cars. The belief was, if people are going to be told about cars, we need to find experts. And so they would troll the world of motoring journalism and try and find a unique voice. That's how they found Jeremy Clarkson. Jeremy Clarkson was a very entertaining and individualistic writer for Fast Car magazine, or was it Fast Lane? Fast Lane or Fast Car he started with. And they thought, every year they used to drag a load of us in. Now, some of them, being journalists, would look at the camera like it was a machine gun that was being pointed at them. And obviously they couldn't really translate what was written on the printed page into, you know, a TV news item. But occasionally they'd come across massive show-offs and egotists like Jeremy Clarkson and me, and they'd take us on. And I remember my boss at the time, who was an old school BBC boss, and he said, now listen, you're going to be the motorbike man, and you've got to remember that most people are terrified of motorcycles. There are only 1.1 million motorcycle license holders in the UK in a nation of 70 million. So he said, so the vast majority of people think that motorbikes are noisy, dirty, dangerous things, and it's your job to be the acceptable face of motorcycling, which I have to say, my friends found hilarious because I had, shall we say, a checkered career when it came to observing speed limits and such like. But once I got on the telly, I heard my boss's voice saying, you're the acceptable face of motorcycling, behave yourself and don't use any spicy language.
And how did they find you in the first place? And what was the interview like?
Well, I'll tell you how they found me. I was living in Manchester, and I used to go into the office where I worked as the editor of a motorbike magazine. And we ran about 8 or 9 motorbike magazines out to this big office in South Manchester. But I was, for some reason, the only one of us who came into the office from the north, on the north side. because the south side was leafy Cheshire, which is considerably nicer and more upmarket than North Manchester, where I'm from, which, as you can probably tell from my speaking voice, is a bit grittier, shall we say. So it was my job to get a pint of milk for our tea, because, of course, we ran on adrenaline and tea, as well as petrol and nitrous oxide and whatever. And I used to see a chap called Dennis sometimes at the newsagent. And he told me that he had a BMW. Now, here's how times change, my friend, because this was the end of the 80s, early 90s. And back then, BMW's reputation in the bike world was that they built motorcycles for old men and the police. That was it. It was completely at odds with their reputation for cars when they were making fantastic cars like the M3 and the M5. Their motorcycles were so dull and boring. Not now, I hasten to say, but this was 30 years ago. And I knew that this chap Dennis had a BMW. And after, Lord knows how many times I've spoken to him, he said, you know who I am, don't you? And I said, yeah, you're Dennis. Nice chap, you've got a BMW. He said, I'm the producer of Top Gear. I said, oh, very good. And just walked out of the newsagents. And he followed me out and he said, I think you'd be good on the television. Why don't you come down and have a try out? So I went down there and I got sent at first to see how it was done. He said, what you need to do is to go along on a shoot and see how it works. And the first shoot that I went along on was presented by a certain Mr. Jeremy Clarkson. And I'll never forget this. He turned up 2 hours late. Oh. I turned up half an hour early because I wanted to impress. He turned up 2 hours late and the crew were fuming, absolutely fuming. And I thought, right, make a point, don't do that because you want the crew on your side. But yeah, so what they used to do, the thing was, it was very clever of them because back then, we all wrote our own scripts because we were journalists, so they didn't need to employ script writers. We wrote for a living. We all wrote for a living. Me, Jeremy, Quentin Wilson. We were writers. We wrote our scripts. And the other thing was, they didn't have to check the facts. They put that on us. They said, just make sure it's all right. I used to wake up in the middle of the night thinking, I remember calling the producer once because the programme went out on a Thursday. I'd done the voiceover on the Wednesday, and I woke up in the middle of the night and I thought, Gerald Ford wasn't the president, he was the president-elect. I'd said that when this particular car came out, Gerald Ford was the president. And then it suddenly came to me in the night, he was only the president-elect. And I rang the producer, and he said, Steve, two things. No one's going to notice. And two, it is 1:45 in the morning. And then he said a rude swear word. But, you know, it's okay. But I think they were glad that we were so bothered about getting the facts right. And then when Jeremy and James and Richard, although it was Jason Daw, when they brought the programme back in the format that most people know, the Three Amigos format, the programme had changed in a way into more of an entertainment show than a consumer show. But those three guys were all still journalists. They were not actors. They were not presenters. When they left after Jeremy started throwing hands because his steak was cold or something like that, they got Chris Evans, they got Matt LeBlanc, and for me, my mother is one of the sweetest person that walks this earth. She never has a bad thing to say about anybody. But I went round, she's in her 80s. I went round to see her when they changed it to Chris Evans and Matt LeBlanc. And my mother was dusting and she stopped and she said, well, I've watched that new version of Top Gear, Stephen, and I have to say, it's dreadful. And I thought, wow, for my mother to say that, it must be really bad. And I think that was the end of the game because the people watching it were being entertained by Clarkson, Hammond and May, but they knew that all three of them had a solid background in motoring journalism.
And speaking of Clarkson...
Yeah. When they said, I think it's like, or I don't think it's as good as they actually had the knowledge and the experience. When Joey from Friends, no disrespect to Matt LeBlanc, Actually, some disrespect to Matt LeBlanc. When Matt LeBlanc expressed his opinion on the Di Tommaso Pantera, as opposed to the equivalent Ferrari or Maserati, had he ever driven the other two cars? I'll bet he hadn't, because he was too busy being an actor. They ruined it. And that's why people watch Grand Tour. Because again, Jeremy Clarkson's been writing a motoring column for the Sun newspaper and the Sunday Times here in the UK for over 30 years. Do you realise how many cars that is over that time? It's hundreds and hundreds, it's thousands of cars. So, not that he and I ever really got on. We butted heads, me and Jezza. But I've got to give the guy respect, because when he opens his mouth to express one of his strongly held opinions, he knows what he's talking about, and people know that. And that's why they respect the guy, even if they don't like him. Like me. I don't like him, but I respect him.
Well, exactly like you said, Steve, very easy to watch on screen. What's Clarkson like off screen?
Late. He and I never got on.
Why?
Well, we sort of did. We sort of did at the start. And then I started to be on the show more. And then, as well as the motorbikes, because I started on it, for a few years, I just did motorbikes. But then I started to do cars, and I started to get some of the jobs that Jeremy assumed would be his. Like, there was a new Lamborghini, the car that we now know as the Gallardo. It had a different name in development. I got wind of it. As a journalist, I got wind of it, approached somebody in the organisation, because at the time I was writing with Auto Italia magazine in the UK. They had contacts in Italy, so I had contacts in Italy. And when Clarkson found out that I was in the frame to go and drive that car, he went potty. He was absolutely... It was like, because when I was the bike guy, it was fine. But as soon as I sort of started to be... Jeremy's great. I mean, anybody who watched Grand Tour or Top Gear, Three Amigos Top Gear, him and Richard and James, would know there's a hierarchy there, isn't there? They're not equal, the three of them. There's James, and there's Richard, and then there's Jezza. And Jezza's the leader of the gang, isn't he? If they were the Black Widows in those old Clint Eastwood films, Jezza would be the guy in the German helmet with the horns on. He's the leader of the Black Widows, isn't he? So, in real life, Jeremy is a less bombastic version of that person that you see on the screen. You couldn't act that persona for all the years that he has. He is kind of like that. And like I said, even though he and I never really got on together, the last time I met him in person, there was a bar. It was at a car show, and there was an open bar. And he said, "Berry, people know we don't like each other. I'll buy you a pint, and we'll stand over there pretending we like each other." So we're at the bar. I said, "Go on then." So he bought me a pint, and we're there chatting away. And I could see people, because it was a car show with lots of industry people, and they were walking past. He and I got to the point where I was interviewed by Britain's then best-selling newspaper, and the title was "I Wish He'd Fall in a Hole in the Ground," with a picture of me, which I did say, but they cut off the end of the sentence where I'd said to the News of the World, I'd said, "I wish he'd fall in a hole in the ground so I could have his job." And then said, "Not that I don't like him or wish him any ill will." They just used the bit at the beginning, which I had to admit to my boss when he called me in a furious rage, saying, "Why did you say these things to the News of the World?" Although subsequently I did become the motoring editor of the News of the World, which again I'll say, whatever you think of it, was Britain's. I mean, it seems strange to be in a Britain without the News of the World, because for many decades it was the best-selling newspaper in the UK.
Well, to even hear the notion that the News of the World, it might have put a misleading headline, I don't believe that at all. I'm just going to move on to the fact. Who is a better driver, you or Jeremy Clarkson?
Well, that's a good one. When you say a better driver, do you mean a faster driver?
Yes, of course.
I don't know. I have raced, not very well, because I have a problem when I race. I either finish well or the car is completely destroyed in a horrendous crash, because it seems that I only ever crash on the fast corners at race circuits. Forget first or second gear hairpins. I'm all about fourth or fifth gear flat out turns. And if you go onto YouTube, I think you can still see me going flat in fifth in a 2-litre Ford through the Craner Curves at Donington Park in the English Midlands. And I think I rolled 6 times.
Wow.
The accident, let me put it this way. It was quite a big meeting that it happened at. And the accident was so extreme that I damaged the track so badly that the entire meeting had to be suspended, not just the race that I was in, the whole thing. And we were the support race. We weren't even the main attraction. So I'm not sure, but I know for a fact that neither Jeremy or I are anything like the standard of a racing driver. I've been very lucky to know some of the greatest drivers of my generation. Well, not my generation, even older generations. People like Ari Vatanen and Marco Allen, the Scandinavian rally drivers. People like Mark Higgins, the rally driver turned stuntman who you see in all the James Bond movies. My pal Anthony Reid, who's one of the stars of Super Touring in the 90s and consistently one of the fastest drivers at Goodwood. I've been in car with these guys, and their level of ability and control is absolutely mind-blowing.
I think what I'm getting, Steve, is a very diplomatic but also a long-winded way of saying that you're a faster driver.
Let me just say something. If it was motorbikes, I don't think he'd get out of the car park. And if we were on a track, I would fall off rather than let Clarkson come past me on a motorbike. That would never happen.
So to speak on safety, as you said, you flipped a car 8 times. Famously, Top Gear's been suspended for many years now after Freddie Flintoff's crash. It hasn't returned. Is it purely the case of health and safety that stopped the show?
Don't think so. I think that's the easy answer. And I think it's more complicated than that. It pains me to say this, but it's hard to ignore the inevitable. A lot of people would like to ignore the inevitable, but I'm supposed to be a journalist, and so I kind of have to speak as I find it. And what I find is that enthusiasm for cars and for motorcycles it's waning, it's disappearing. Do you know what it's similar? Do you know what it's very similar to? I'll tell you. It's very similar to rock music. Now, there's a great debate at the moment about the end of rock music. Black Sabbath just played their final ever farewell gig. Although, having said that, I did go to the farewell tour 5 years ago. So who knows, there may be another farewell tour. But Ozzy had to sit in a chair that he was strapped into. So I very much think that that's the end for them. Paul McCartney seems to be on a farewell tour. Glastonbury, they're not having Glastonbury next year, but when it comes back, which band would be big enough to play Glastonbury? What, U2, Coldplay, maybe? Those guys are getting, into their 50s and 60s now? And it seems to be, to me, the same with cars and with motorbikes. That passion is fading.
As well, I think a big organisation like the BBC as well, it's facing enormous competition from the likes of YouTube. You have independent people with a lot of passion, with a lot of energy, a lot of time, and they don't necessarily need a salary. There's some absolutely enormous channels on YouTube which are pumping out absolutely A-grade car content.
Yeah, not much of it is from the UK though. Most of the stuff that I watch is made in North America. I have to say, people like, Hoovy's Garage, Vinwicki, Jay Leno's Garage, stuff like that. And then there's the more sort of esoteric guys, Whistling Diesel and all that. I do like the crazy hillbilly stuff. It's a million miles away from my experience of motoring. These trucks that have their own zip code that that have got like 2,000 brake horsepower and spew, enormous amounts of thick black smoke. I find that stuff quite entertaining, but I do wonder. I've tried myself with YouTube, and I think I've realised that the sort of content that I got used to producing on what we call linear television, I didn't just work for Top Gear. I made motoring shows for 4 or 5 different linear television companies here in the UK, Channel 4, Channel 5, Sky, the BBC, ITV, and it was all kind of TV program-ish, but the YouTube content, there's a guy on there, Vice Grip Garage, Derek. I don't know if you're familiar with the guy, but it's just some guy who's got a very appealing character. He travels right across North America. He buys these old cars sight unseen. He tries to fix them up, and then he tries to drive home, often like 1,000 miles or 1,500 miles. And I will happily sit there and watch this guy on his adventure, even though he's not just fixing the cars, he's filming it, he's recording the sound, and then when he gets home, he's editing it all down and sticking it on YouTube. There used to be in Manchester, where I live, outside the cathedral, there used to be a guy, a busker, and he was a one-man band, and he played the drums, and he had a kazoo on a frame, and he had cymbals on his knees, and he used to bang them together. And then he was playing an accordion as well at the same time. And I thought, Derek's like that guy who used to do that. And when I started in television for the BBC back in the 90s, on a shoot for Top Gear, there'd be 7 or 8 people. And now it's like one guy with a mobile phone, and he's doing the whole thing. He's editing it on his phone. He's shooting it on his phone, he's recording the sound on his phone, and he's editing it on his phone. So what future there would be for a car show? Car shows are expensive. I remember sitting in a room with a BBC executive once, and he listened to my proposal for another kind of car show. This was for like a custom car show, cars that are one-offs, unusual cars that have been I was inspired by a man who built a car in his cellar, and it had taken him 20 years. And when he finished, he almost had to take his house down. He had to have a wall taken out the side of the building to get the car out. And I thought, we need to tell these stories. And my boss said, very good, Steve, but for far less money, I can make a cooking show or a gardening show. And I can make the gardening show 20 yards away from here in that garden out there. And I can make the cooking show 20 yards away from me in the other direction in a studio. The problem with car shows is, if you looked at Grand Tour or at Top Gear, you have to go around the world to impress people. You can't just go in the car park or in the garden or in the kitchen. You have to go to the salt flats in Namibia or the North Pole or somewhere like that. Or else people are like, oh, well, this isn't as good as the Grand Tour. They set a standard. Do you know what? I've said I don't like him, but I respect him. I think Clarkson, Hammond and May quit at exactly the right time. It was just on the cusp of them starting to... Some of the ideas were coming around for the second or third time. There was still an engaging watch, but I thought, when they quit, I thought, oh, that's good timing.
And speaking of quitting at the right time, I'm just going to move it on to Jaguar. Obviously, they've had a lot of critics recently. Their sales have dropped 98%. That's absolutely staggering. They've rebranded. The opponents will say they've kind of gone woke. They've made these sort of these supercars, if you will, and sales have dropped 98%. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, there's been a lot of people who have taken this as an opportunity to bash the woke movement. I don't think there is a woke movement. Nobody's made me aware of it. When I saw that, I thought, this is the last throw of the dice. Jaguar has been in trouble for 50 years. It's staggered from one benefactor to another to try and prop up an ailing business. I mean, think about the glory days of Jaguar. My grandfather, John Moore, was a Jaguar man. He had fantastic taste in cars, my granddad, and in motorbikes. In motorbikes, he like Enzo Ferrari, he liked a Rudge motorcycle. My granddad had Enzo Ferrari. Big fans of the Rudge made in Coventry. In cars, he had an Elvis, he had a Triumph VTS, and he had a dark green Jaguar Mark II with the 3.8 engine. What a car. Can you imagine, as a boy, I used to go and sit in that car. He'd let me start it. He'd say, Stephen, go and warm the oil in the Jaguar before he took it out. Like a 7-year-old boy, I used to run outside with the keys and start this incredible car. But that's 60-odd years ago that was made. The debacle that was British Leyland with Jaguar, those terribly built cars, beautiful cars, but terribly built. The XJ40, I've had an XJ40. Most people on the internet talking about the XJ40 never had one. It wasn't a great car. It had all sorts of problems. And of course, the biggest problem for Jaguar came in the shape of BMW, Audi and Mercedes. They took that market off Jaguar. When Ford bought it for £2.5 billion at the end of the 80s, they invested hundreds of millions of dollars into Jaguar. They built some fairly decent cars. I've had a few of them. I had an S-Type R for my for my paint, and I had an XJR, the supercharged X300, which I thought was a great-looking car. It went well. It made a fantastic noise. And inside, the wood and leather reminded me of my grandfather's car. But you can only trade on that nostalgia for so long. And this, for Jaguar, is a last throw of the dice. The cars that they've been making weren't bad cars. The XK, the F-Type, great-looking cars, fantastic performance. You know, maybe not quite the same cachet. Well, not quite the same cachet as an Aston Martin or a Ferrari, but perhaps in the real world more practical and usable. And guess what? Nobody wanted them. So what are they supposed to do? Are they just supposed to carry on building cars that hark back to the 1960s and the 1950s that nobody wants? No. A radical, bold, imaginative reinvention. And if some people can't see that those commercials were deliberately designed to alienate them, then they must be easy to fool. I wouldn't mind playing poker with those people who started ranting and raving and frothing at the mouth and saying how woke it was. They've done that deliberately to get rid of you lot. They're going to reinvent themselves. They're going to build a car that costs 10 times as the X-Type they were flogging a few years ago, and they're going to try and sell them to Chinese billionaires. And I wish them all the luck in the world, because to me, Jaguar is one of the greatest brands in the history of the motor industry. I hope they survive, but it won't be like it was, because the world's changed.
And finally, we're just going to finish on briefly. I hear you're in the process yourself of starting up a car brand, a sports car for under the value of $23,000. What inspired you to start this endeavour?
I thought you'd never ask. Thank you for asking. Two things inspired me. One is the Lotus Elite. We've talked about my love of Lotus. I think that Colin Chapman is the preeminent genius of the British car industry, and there were certainly quite a few of them, you know, whether it's Isigonis or Sir William Lyons or Peter Stevens, who's actually a friend of mine, the man who designed the McLaren F1. I think the Lotus Elite of 1959, the first car that had a monocoque. It wasn't a body on chassis, the first production car to be built on a monocoque. And I was inspired by that, and I thought, why have sports cars become so incredibly complex and so insanely powerful? What if we went back to the principles of the Lotus Elite, a car that was super lightweight and which had skinny tyres and had about 75 brake horsepower? Now, most people would think, 75 brake horsepower, you can't have a sports car. Yes, you can, because as Colin Chapman knew, and his mantra was, add lightness. We intend to build a super light car with about 75 brake horsepower. It won't need power steering. It won't need ABS. It won't need traction control. Remove weight, add lightness. And the other thing that inspired me were the pedal cars. that were built. A friend of mine wrote a book, Lee Marshall wrote a book about the pedal cars that were built at a factory in South Wales that were replicas of the Austin. And people might remember our now King Charles and his brother Prince Andrew in those little pedal cars, because they used to sell them in Harrods, the department store. Those little pedal cars were made by disabled miners, guys that had worked in the mines in South Wales but had been injured. And somebody had the bright idea of finding employment for these guys, something for them to do so they could work and earn a wage again, these proud men who'd worked in the mines. And they built these fantastic little pedal cars. And I thought, what if we in Manchester could give employment to perhaps disabled ex-servicemen? I've been talking to an organisation that's involved with those kind of guys. If we could build a super lightweight car that was still very much fun to drive, but harked back to that concept from all those years ago. Stop making things with 1,000 horsepower. We've got enough hypercars. And why do they have to be so expensive? Let's build something that's lightweight, simple and fun and retails for a fraction of the cost of this other stuff. You don't need to go crazy fast to have fun. If a car is simple and it's very direct and you feel connected to the road, 50 miles an hour can feel like 150 miles an hour.
And that's a great place to end it there. We wish you the very best of luck in your endeavours with that. I'm sure when it's built, you'll have to come back on the show. But for now, Steve Berry, former Top Gear presenter, thanks so much for your time. That's all we have time for today on Global News Today. Thanks for watching and be sure to join us tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.